Welcome and good morning to commissioners, commission staff, our panelists, and the public. We are live in San Juan, Puerto Rico at the Inter-American University of Puerto Rico Law School and watching and listening virtually. This briefing will come to order. This is a briefing of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights on civil rights implications of disaster relief, Hurricane María in Puerto Rico. It is 9:08 a.m. Atlantic Standard Time on December 10th, 2021. Commissioners present at this briefing are present virtually and in person, and they are Commissioner Adams, Commissioner Adegbile, Commissioner Gilchrist, Commissioner Harriet, Commissioner Kursanow, Commissioner Chladni, and Commissioner Yaki. A quorum of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights is present. I note for the record that the staff director and the court reporter are present. I wish to welcome everyone to our briefing on civil rights implications of disaster relief, Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. The field briefing has three goals. First, to review the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA or FEMA, and their role in disaster preparedness and response. Secondly, evaluate efforts by FEMA to comply with the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Act, along with other federal civil rights laws and policies. And three, compare the response of FEMA to significant hurricane systems, including but not limited to Hurricanes Harvey and Maria. Today's briefing will focus on the civil rights implications of the federal response and impact of Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico by receiving testimony from subject matter experts such as government officials, academics, advocates, and during today's briefing, in-person public comments from those people who were impacted by the hurricanes. Before we begin our briefing, I'd like to address a few housekeeping matters. I share deep thanks to Commission staff who researched and brought today's briefing into being, including the expert team we have who worked on the logistics, for which organizing a field briefing is compounded by the global pandemic environment, and it presents a whole host of additional challenges. I'd also like to thank our partners, Puerto Rico, the Inter-American University of Puerto Rico Law School, its Associate Dean of Academic Affairs, Cesar Alvarado, and Professor and Commissioner of the Civil Rights Commission in Puerto Rico, Andres Cordova. The Civil Rights Commission in Puerto Rico, its Executive Director, Ever Padilla Ruiz, and their staff. Their partnership made the Commission's trip and today's briefing possible. A special thank you to the community leaders in El Caño and Loíza for meeting with us yesterday and sharing their collective ongoing efforts to rebuild their communities after Hurricane Maria. And finally, I thank Staff Director of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, Mauro Morales, for his leadership, and I thank my colleagues on the Commission for their leadership. A note on the resources available today. For anyone in need of language translation services, please see our staff and volunteers at the registration desk for translation equipment. If during the briefing anyone requires emotional support, please see one of our volunteers who will direct you to the therapists we have on site. This is very serious and some people may be triggered, and so we will be there for you. If you wish to sign up for the public comments, please see one of our volunteers who will direct you to the sign-up room for further information. And finally, the COVID cleaning protocol. Due to the ongoing pandemic, the university is taking extra precautions for this event. The briefing will break for 1 hour at lunch. Because the time is limited to complete this cleaning, please be sure to leave as soon as possible when we announce the break for lunch. And please be sure to take all your belongings with you, as we cannot guarantee they'll still be there, or maybe they will be so sanitized you won't recognize them. During the course of the testimony and the question and answer period, I caution all speakers, including our commissioners, to refrain from speaking over each other for the ease of transcription. Additionally, I will need to cue our staff behind the scenes for the appropriate video and audio support, so please wait to speak until I have called upon you. Panelists, you each have 7 minutes to speak. Please note that to ensure that we have sufficient time for our discussion this morning, I will enforce the 7-minute rule. Please monitor your time so you do not risk my cutting you off in mid-sentence, and I will do it. I will strictly enforce the time allotment given to each panelist to present his or her statement. And if we didn't receive your testimony, that's all right, because we can supplement the record. But when you've sent your testimony, that means that we have it and we've read it. So you can summarize it. And we will appreciate that so that you can use your 7 minutes best. Focus your remarks on the topic, and we will all be happy and smiling when this is over. After the panel presentation, commissioners will have the opportunity to ask questions within the allotted period of time. It varies from panel. The larger panels have an hour, the smaller panels have 45 minutes. And I will recognize the commissioners who wish to speak. I ask my fellow commissioners to do our part and keep our questions and comments concise, and to be cognizant of the interest of having each commissioner be allowed to ask questions. So please be brief, and so we can move quickly and efficiently. Today's briefing features 13 distinguished speakers who will provide us with a diverse array of viewpoints. Panel 1 will consist of speakers who will discuss the role and responsibilities in the execution of federal aid in response to natural disasters. Panel 2 will consist of advocacy, nonprofit relief groups, and academics who will discuss the impact of the federal government response on these communities. So with those bits of housekeeping out of the way, we're going to proceed. And I turn now to Commissioner Adegbeleng for opening remarks.
Good morning. It's good to be with you. I'd like to thank all of you for coming today. And the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights is very pleased to be here with you and to be here with you in person. Today's briefing continues what is a 60-year tradition of having this body, the United States Civil Rights Commission, come into the field to be proximate to the civil rights issues that face the people of the United States. We're very pleased to be here, and this is the third in a series of 3 briefings that we have had on hurricane response topics and FEMA's role. With this in-person briefing, we're also going to reintroduce a public comment session. In our prior briefings, 2 that I will describe in a moment, we did them virtually because of the pandemic. And in that virtual format, the public comment was difficult to accomplish. Today, due to the courtesy of our hosts here at Inter-American, we're going to be able to hear from public members that want to share their comments as well. As the chair noted, during our trip, we've already had the opportunity to travel a bit around the island and to see and hear, importantly, from members of the community. Yesterday, we spent some powerful hours with the people at El Caño and then at Loíza, as you've heard. Those meetings added layers to the continuing difficulties that people face on the other side of the hurricane, and animated for us in a very powerful way what the continuing needs are to recover. Hearing from those members was an integral part of this trip. The purpose of our study, as the chair has noted, is to gather this information about hurricane response, to put it in a report that will ultimately be available to both the President and Congress so that we can improve. In particular, we're looking at the responses to Hurricane Harvey in Texas and Hurricane Maria here, though we understand there have been several hurricanes that have impacted these parts of the country. During the June virtual briefing, we heard from, among others, the Acting Associate Administrator of Response and Recovery at FEMA, the Region 6 Administrator from FEMA, the Deputy Inspector General from DHS OIG, the Deputy Inspector General from HUD OIG, the Director of Homeland Security and Justice, and the Director of the Office of Equal Rights at FEMA. In October of this year, we held a virtual briefing where the focus was on the people of Houston, Texas. And there we heard from state and local governments, as well as impacted members of the community and local advocates. Today, of course, we are with you here in San Juan, Puerto Rico, to hear from state and local government officials, non-governmental organizations, and community organizations, as well as the impacted community. We very much look forward to your testimony, and it's our hope that our work together will help improve the United States' ability to respond to these disasters, which, unfortunately, we will continue to face. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner Agdegbile. I turn now to Commissioner Yaki for opening remarks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. This is an intensely personal hearing for me for a number of reasons. First, you are our first in-person briefing since COVID. And we are honored that you are our first in-person briefing because I could not fathom having this investigation without coming here, meeting you, going out to the communities, going to Alcaño, Martin Peña, going to Louisa. These are the things that make, to me, the Civil Rights Commission come alive. But it's intensely personal to me because I have lived through a natural disaster. I went through an earthquake in San Francisco some years back. I've lived overseas where the Pacific equivalent of typhoons came and just ravaged the islands in which I lived. And when I saw what was happening to Puerto Rico from Maria, and I was watching what wasn't happening, it did not strike me as a good thing. It did not strike me as a just thing. It did not strike me that we were doing what we should do for citizens of our country. And so that's why we are here today, because we want to know what happened, how it happened. And in particular, as we have looked at the comparisons between Harvey and Maria, and frankly, it wasn't that hard a comparison to do in many respects, except for one, and one that we keep on hearing time and time again, whether it's from a virtual hearing in Houston, whether it's in Alcaño, whether it's in Louisa, and whether it's going to be from here today, and that is FEMA's ability, or lack thereof, to deal with Spanish language people and culture. But there's more to that when it comes to Puerto Rico. I mean, that's one of the great things going on and talking to people out in the communities, understanding the bigger challenges that are here, where we know that cookie cutter responses do not and cannot and never have really worked. They must be tailored to the individual communities in which we work, in which you live. But having a federal government that doesn't understand that doesn't address that, and in some ways, in so doing, discriminates against you for doing that, that's what we want to hear from you today. So I want to thank all of you for coming forward and talking to us today. I want to thank the staff for their great work here today. I really want to thank Ever and Ariana and the others who all pulled together people whose stories we heard firsthand yesterday and we'll hear again today from you. So thank you all very much. We are honored to be here. I am honored to be here in our first in-person briefing in almost 2 years. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner Yaki. Let me now introduce the panelists, and it will be a brief introduction so I can yield the time back to you all. You have many fascinating aspects of your careers, and I'm going to abbreviate it, so I apologize in advance. Our first speaker this morning is Omar Marrero, Secretary of State, Puerto Rico. Our second speaker is the Honorable Carmen Yulín Cruz Soto, former Mayor of San Juan and Weizmann Center Fellow in Leadership, Mount Holyoke College. Our third speaker is Charlotte Gossett Navarro, Chief Director, Puerto Rico Operations, Hispanic Federation. Our fourth speaker is Sergio Marchuach, Policy Director and General Counsel, Centro para la Nueva Economía, Center for the New Economy. Our fifth speaker is Cristina Miranda, Executive Director, Liga de Ciudades Puerto Rico, the League of Cities Puerto Rico. Our sixth speaker is Ever Padilla Ruiz, Executive Director, Comisión de Derechos Civiles, Commission on Civil Rights. Our seventh and final speaker for our panel one is Diane Yentel, President, CEO, the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Secretary Marrero, welcome. Please proceed.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Thank you very much, Chairman Cantu and members of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. For me, it's a pleasure and honor to be in front of you to talk about the issue that we have in front of us. For me, it's also an honor to be part of the first in-person meeting since COVID-19. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you to discuss the Federal Emergency Management Agency's FEMA role in disaster preparedness and response to Hurricane María in Puerto Rico. Over the last 4 years, the government and FEMA have engaged in extensive collaboration to address one of the most complicated and largest disaster relief in U.S. history. Since day one, the people of Puerto Rico and the government of Puerto Rico has essentially asked to be treated as any other U.S. jurisdiction within the U.S. flag. As FEMA has always said, every disaster has to be federally supported, state managed, and locally executed. So if we do that in every single corner of the U.S. nation, we will not necessarily have to tailor disaster aid. It's just to support the government of the people to execute and be able to address disaster response. I think that one of the most complex aspect of the disaster response and disaster recovery in Puerto Rico is the fact that before Hurricanes Irma and Maria, Puerto Rico was already facing a man-made disaster, which was the fiscal and economic crisis that started in 2006. And this is very important to have in mind because it was in 2016 that Congress approved the law known as PROMESA, which is essentially a law that allowed Puerto Rico, or provided the government of Puerto Rico, to have a very similar or two ways to restructure our debt, or $70 billion in debt, but also not only provide that restructuring tools, one as a bankruptcy-like process, and the second one in a process very similar to how sovereign nations restructure their debt. But in addition to that restructuring process, restructuring tool, they also impose an oversight board, a control board. And this is very important because since it was imposed, the control board, which is not elected by the people of Puerto Rico, we have not been controlled in our finances. And why this is important? Because when Irma and Maria both hit, Puerto Rico did not have enough cash in hand to be able to respond to that disaster. In addition to that, we didn't have a rainy day fund like Texas to be able to respond to Harvey, or we didn't have access to the markets as Louisiana and other jurisdictions that they were able to borrow money and respond as they wait for the reimbursement process of FEMA. We didn't have those tools, and this is very important because unfortunately the federal administration did not take that into consideration when they were responding to disaster. The government of Puerto Rico have to depend on the federal response essentially, and also in the oversight board and the Department of Treasury for the access of funds. To give you an example, during that time we were imposed many requirements to access to the federal funds. For example, we were required to establish a centralized oversight authority, which is the Core 3, not because we wanted additional bureaucracy, but because it was required by the government, the federal government, to have that entity. We established that entity. We were also required to have third-party experts to help us to manage those funds because we didn't have the internal capacity. We did that as well. We were also required to impose internal controls, transparency measures, and we did all of that. But it was not until April 2019 that for the first time after Maria, the government of Puerto Rico had the opportunity to take control of the reimbursement process. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the reimbursement process of FEMA, but every single state and every single territory in the U.S. nation, they control the reimbursement process and they certify to the FEMA agency that they comply, and obviously they have to be responsible for the records, the compliance, and the internal controls, and all of that. Unfortunately, in November 2017, the government of the federal administration and FEMA imposed what it was called the 270 manual drawdown process. And this is all very important because every single time as we were approaching or we were trying to comply with this more stringent requirements, the goalpost was essentially moved. And this happened, and that's why when you look at the process of obligations and disbursements, it was really stringent for the government of Puerto Rico and its subrecipients to access the funds in a quick manner. Not only that, but as I said, we were every single time trying to reach or trying to come up with solutions to expedite the recovery process. And it was not until April 2019 that we were able to control the reimbursement process for the first time. Not only that, with the change in administration, we saw how many restrictions that they were imposed upon the government of Puerto Rico, they were released, and with that, the pace of the federal funds have accelerated in a very visible way, not only in obligations, but also in disbursement. And this is not only on the FEMA side, but also on the CDBG and HUD side. So again, we all know about the destruction that it was caused by the hurricanes Irma and Maria. It was the worst case scenario. The government itself was a casualty to this disaster. That obviously was the most complex and the most destructive in 100 years for the people of Puerto Rico. And even though we were just demanding to be treated as any other U.S. citizen in the nation, that was not the case. Since day one after the hurricane, we were required and we were imposed many stringent requirements that any other U.S. jurisdiction did not face. However, that did not stop the government of Puerto Rico, its municipalities, and many government agencies to try to comply as fast as we could in order to access the funds. But unfortunately, it was until the end of the 2020 that we were seeing the first permanent work to being obligated by FEMA. And also we have to bear in mind, and in the last minutes that I have, that FEMA also used Puerto Rico as a laboratory for new policies. We were required to use Section 428, which was a section added to the Stafford Act with approval of the Sandy Recovery Improvement Act of 2013. It was added in order to provide a more flexible way to address a disaster, but that was not the case in Puerto Rico. FEMA was essentially designing the plane while we were flying it. And with that, essentially, many American citizens of Puerto Rico did not have the ability to have their needs properly addressed in a swift manner, even though the government of Puerto Rico, its municipality, and many agencies did whatever they could in order to comply with the requirements and more stringent conditions imposed by the federal administration. Again, I yield my time, and I'm willing and able to answer any question that this honorable commission may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Madero. You set a wonderful example of being heavy in content and brief in time. So gracias. Thank you.
Probably the mayor will improve that.
Thank you. We will now hear from the Honorable Cruz Soto. Please proceed.
Distinguished members of the Commission and fellow panelists, thank you for the opportunity to shine a light on the negligent acts perpetrated by FEMA under the Trump administration in the aftermath of Hurricanes Irma and Maria. Approximately 3,000 Puerto Ricans died after a botched relief effort denied us life-saving support. These deaths could have been prevented if our suffering had been met with urgency and efficiency. Earlier this year, 2 reports from the Inspector General's office concluded what we knew. FEMA was unprepared and mismanaged relief efforts. One of the reports stated it took an average of 69 days, more than 2 months, for the aid to arrive. On its executive summary, it said, and I quote, FEMA cannot ensure it provided commodities to Puerto Rico disaster victims as needed to sustain life and alleviate suffering, end of quote. Under the veil of political neutrality, FEMA's highest managerial levels turned a blind eye to the unequal treatment that cost so many lives. 2 data points paint a clear picture of neglect. 9 days after Hurricane Harvey, there were 30,000 FEMA personnel in Texas. In Puerto Rico, 9 days after Maria, 10,000. It took FEMA 10 days to approve disaster work after Harvey. It took them 43 days to approve the same work in Puerto Rico. FEMA was unable to adapt its standard operating procedures to get their relief operations off the ground on a timely fashion. They kept asking us for reports to be filled out in the internet when they knew we had no electrical power and thus no internet. There was also no consistency in the instructions provided to us. One day we were told to use one form or one system, And a few days later, we were told to use another form and input the same data on another system. A new FEMA employee arrived, and we had to start again, for there was no handoff, no knowledge of what had happened before, only new instructions. Language was another barrier. Not only was the information initially in English, disregarding our first language is Spanish, but FEMA's personnel was incapable of servicing the deaf community and did not take into consideration that people have different levels of internet proficiency and access. And when relief finally arrived, it added insult to injury. I gave you a picture of the food distributed by FEMA about 3 weeks after the crisis. It's a beef jerky, chocolate pudding, a Baby Ruth, Pringles, and applesauce. It's shameful. Not only was this food not suitable, but FEMA was incapable of setting up or help us set up a robust, consistent, and adequate supply chain of aid. In the municipality of San Juan at the time, we were prepared to make breakfast, lunch, and dinner for our employees for 4 months. In the end, we provided meals for them, food for 26 community soup kitchens, food, water, and emergency managed help for approximately 65 elderly homes and elderly care type organizations. New York City Emergency Management, which arrived just a week after Maria, established for us the robust distribution system built on the strengths of our relationships with religious community and recreational leaders. Thus, we were able to provide food and water consistently to 34 San Juan communities. With the help of Goya, Hispanic Federation, Giovanni, Suiza Daily, Tres Monjitas, Chocolate Cortez, and food and water purchased at the municipal level, we were able to meet local nutritional needs. And I showed you the difference between the photo that we provided and the photo of the food that FEMA said that was food and was provided. We also focused our aid distribution on those living with HIV/AIDS, immigrants, elderly, homeless, those with children or adults with physical and emotional challenges. Where FEMA was incapable, we stepped in. We figured it out. FEMA should have had a roadmap, a blueprint for how to do this, and precious time would have been saved. Our first aid came from Chicago, from the diaspora. I remember thinking how they could do it when FEMA couldn't do it. The violation of our civil rights had an immediate and lasting effect. Today, you'll hear a testimony from organizations who had dealt with FEMA's fallout and still are dealing with it. In my written testimony, I've included recommendations on what can be done so FEMA is always prepared to respond. No doubt treatment was different and devastating. Think about this. Hurricane Harvey impacted 13 million people and 88 people died. Maria affected 3.5 million and 3,000 people died. One life is not more important than another, but negligence no doubt took a toll. Why the inequity? For those then in power, we were less important because we are colonial subjects. Black and brown people, 60% below the poverty line. Today, December 10th, the world commemorates Human Rights Day. We have the duality of being United States citizens and Puerto Rican nationals, two nations where one colonized another, and in 1917 gave us American citizenship by birth. Yes, our civil rights were violated after Maria, but our human rights as a nation invaded, colonized, and exploited have been long violated. They were violated while the island of Vieques was used by the U.S. Navy as target practice, violated while the effects of contraceptives 20 times more potent than those finally approved were tried in Puerto Rican women, violated today when a fiscal control board reduces the hopes of our current and future generations by decreasing pensions and increasing the cost of education at the university level. While the violation of our human rights is addressed in the other forums, we can move forward and together to ensure what happened in Puerto Rico in 2017 does not ever happen again. Never must a life be lost because FEMA or any other agency is incapable of putting action plans into place, treating people with urgency, dignity, and respect. Never again must the price of incompetence be the lives of so many. I am hopeful and confident we can move forward in this common endeavor. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Honorable Cruz Soto. And I am at a loss for words. Already I have heard two of the best speakers I have in my life, so thank you very much. Now we will turn to hear from Ms. Navarro, so please proceed.
I Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I'm particularly humbled with the other panelists, both from the panel I'm on now and the speakers who I know are coming on the second panel, many of whom are cited in the written version of our comments that we'll be submitting. For the purposes of time, I'm just going to be reading some excerpts from that, and I'll try to skip over things that have already been mentioned by the previous two panelists. It has been more than 4 years since Hurricane Maria impacted Puerto Rico. It was an unprecedented emergency that left unimaginable death and destruction in its wake, from which we have still not recovered today. The more than 3,000 lives taken too soon, the forced displacement of hundreds of thousands of residents, the ongoing plague of blue tarps on rooftops, the months of schooling the children lost, the long, anxious wait for promised help to arrive, and the darkness, the never-ending darkness. There is no doubt that both U.S. federal and Puerto Rico central governments failed to manage the crisis and protect the people. The federal government response was inefficient, ineffective, and inequitable. This, especially when compared to the significant rapid assistance offered by the Trump administration to Texas after Hurricane Harvey and Florida after Hurricane Irma, which hit those states just weeks before Hurricane Maria. Their Puerto Rico response was hampered from the outset by a lack of familiarity and sensitivity to cultural norms, structures of local government and institutions, the unique legal framework here, language barriers, and geography. This lack of familiarity and sensitivity, coupled with their opaque, bureaucratic, and rigid processes, their centralization, discriminatory political interference by the previous administration, and unique administrative barriers imposed on Puerto Rico, undermined recovery efforts by FEMA and other federal agencies. Hurricane Maria was neither the first nor last disaster in Puerto Rico. Just since 2017, Puerto Rico has experienced 2 hurricanes, Irma and Maria, devastating earthquakes, tropical storms, more flooding, suffocating austerity, and the ongoing global pandemic, among other challenges. These disasters have laid bare the archipelago's complex economic, social, political, and environmental vulnerabilities. Over the last decade, Puerto Rico has experienced a consistent poverty rate of over 40%, an average unemployment rate over 11%, the lowest median income of any U.S. state or territory, tightening austerity measures, and a dramatic 11.8% decline in population. However, this situation was unsurprising as it is firmly rooted in more than 100 years of discriminatory policies and an unjust balance of power between the federal government and the people of Puerto Rico. This historic context and precarious conditions must be fully accounted for when evaluating what a just, equitable, and sustainable emergency response and recovery to Hurricane Maria should have been. Hispanic Federation is a 30-year-old nonprofit organization. And immediately after Hurricane Maria, we began one of the largest private emergency relief and sustainable recovery efforts in Puerto Rico. To date, HF has raised and invested more than $42 million in private funding into the recovery of the archipelago. And with those funds, we have provided grants to more than 130 local nonprofit organizations and executed multiple large-scale initiatives. This included chartering the first humanitarian private relief flight on September 23rd, which brought the emergency personnel from New York City that the mayor is mentioning. That was the first of 25 humanitarian flights chartered by Hispanic Federation. We reached all 78 municipalities with an estimated 7.4 million pounds of food, water, and other emergency supplies. Simultaneous to our response here in Puerto Rico, we were also working with our networks to support the displaced community in the various states across the U.S. where they were resettling. In particular, the ongoing relationships that we have built with a diverse network of Puerto Rico-based nonprofits has been foundational to our impact. It has long been clear to us that the unsung heroes and first responders of the hurricane relief and recovery efforts are Puerto Rico's nonprofit organizations, grassroots community leaders, and mutual aid networks. We witnessed this firsthand after the hurricane, again after the earthquakes, and most recently during the COVID-19 pandemic. However, neither FEMA nor the Puerto Rico government has fully acknowledged and integrated these groups into emergency relief efforts, nor have they been fully remunerated for the work they completed that was the responsibility of the government. FEMA and the Puerto Rico governments have at times shrugged responsibility and suggested it's the household's responsibility, not theirs, to adequately prepare for and recover from a disaster, including evacuating, fortifying homes, storing food and water reserves to last multiple days, and then looking to home insurance savings, and loans to get back on their feet, and that may be a reasonable expectation for the average U.S. household. However, for families who live in poverty, rely on public food benefits, or live on limited fixed incomes, as so many in Puerto Rico do, there is no money left over to buy extra food reserves, to easily evacuate a community or an island before or after a disaster, or to obtain that insurance, those savings, or those loans to help finance a quick recovery. The mayor has already gone into the problems with the emergency supply distribution. We question why it took so long to bring supplies when airports were open just days after, we know, because we were sending airplanes to Puerto Rico. With food, the food that's been investigated, how nutritiously deficient the food was, and how it promoted dangerous levels of salt and sugar intake. Again, when considering equity and a disaster relief, you have to consider the health of people. We know that there is a deep connection between poverty and health outcomes, and yet they were sending candy and calling it meals. In addition, if we look to our individual assistance for housing, there we see the language access issues that were mentioned when you have inspectors who spoke no Spanish and knew nothing about Puerto Rico. Another major issue that I'm sure will be discussed later was how many families were denied on the basis of home ownership when it's not even a requirement that they provide a title in the Stafford Act. And yet FEMA did nothing to communicate with the families who had been unjustly denied, despite being asked by advocates repeatedly to do so. When we think about, again, comparisons, we can also look to the fact that in Harvey, families got an average of $6,980 in Texas, and in Puerto Rico, less than $3,000. The Transitional Sheltering Assistance Program in the United States for families staying in hotels also lacked language access and appropriate services. When we look at public assistance, when we look at mitigation, all of those programs also require the applicants to speak English and apply in English. But egregiously for us is the lack of data transparency. And in one example I want to share before I close, the fact that one of our nonprofit agencies that we work with requested data from FEMA to be able to provide support to individuals with disabilities. It took 9 months to receive that data. And we know that those were the communities that were most vulnerable here and who lost their lives. Had they been provided that data and that collaboration, many lives may have been saved. Thank you.
Thank you, perfect. Ms. Navarro, I'm speechless, perfect. I now call on Mr. Marshwash. We will hear from you. Please proceed.
Good morning, distinguished members of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, fellow witnesses, and all those who are following these proceedings. We at the Center for a New Economy believe it is important to bear witness about the way Hurricane Maria victims were mistreated by some agencies of the federal government. It is a moral obligation we owe to those who suffer in the immediate aftermath of the 2017 storms, to those who are still living with the consequences, and to people who, unfortunately, in the future will become victims of natural disasters. I have submitted a full version of my statement for the record, so this morning I will use my allotted time briefly to highlight some of the ways both FEMA and the Department of Housing and Urban Development have treated Puerto Rico unfairly in the reconstruction process. With respect to FEMA, I would like to underscore a point made by Secretary Marrero. An amendment to the Presidential Disaster Declaration for Hurricane Maria, dated November 2, 2017, required FEMA to obligate all large-scale project funding for public assistance permanent work for Puerto Rico through alternative procedures. Under these procedures, FEMA and Puerto Rico had to agree to a fixed cost estimate for each project related to permanent works. We're talking about thousands of projects prior to the obligation of funds. According to the GAO, no state or territory had ever been required to use these alternative procedures for 100% of their permanent work projects after a natural disaster. Given the magnitude of the damage caused by Hurricane Maria, it was foreseeable that the use of these alternative procedures will present implementation challenges and delays in developing fixed cost estimates. Basically because Puerto Rico was responsible for any costs that exceeded those fixed cost estimates under the alternative procedures, FEMA and Puerto Rico had to agree on the appropriate guidance to develop those estimates. It was not until February 2020 that the GAO reported that FEMA had developed guidance for developing those fixed costs. However, it also found that the guidance did not meet all of the GAO's best practices for estimating costs, and the GAO recommended that FEMA revise the guidance to adhere more closely to best practices. To be fair to FEMA, since 2019, it has implemented several changes to its public assistance program in Puerto Rico, which have expedited the obligation of funds. According to the GAO, as of January 15, 2021, FEMA had obligated $17.5 billion for 4,793 public assistance permanent work projects. However, the actual expenditure of funds remains painfully slow. According to the same GAO report, of the $17.5 billion obligated for permanent work projects, only $157.7 million, or less than 1%, had been spent as of January 15, 2021. Finally, we note that as of January 2021, more than 3 years after Hurricane Maria, FEMA was still developing cost estimates for 5,279 projects related to the 2017 hurricanes. With respect to HUD, between September 2017 and June 2019, Congress appropriated approximately $20.3 billion in community development block grant disaster recovery funds and mitigation funds for disaster reconstruction and mitigation activities related to Hurricane Irma and Maria in Puerto Rico. The usual process for disbursing these funds is somewhat cumbersome. As shown in Exhibit C to my written statement, after Congress appropriates the money, OMB issues an apportionment document to HUD, and then HUD has to publish a notification in the Federal Register. The intended beneficiary then proceeds to draft an action plan for the use of funds in accordance with the published regulations. If and when the action plan is approved by HUD, then the parties need to execute a grant agreement to allow the expenditure of funds. However, as shown in Exhibit D to my statement, this process has been particularly, some would say, suspiciously slow in the case of funds allocated for mitigation activities in Puerto Rico. Indeed, a report issued by HUD's Office of Inspector General on April 20, 2021 found that the Trump administration set up several bureaucratic obstacles that substantially slowed down the process for dispersing these funds. With respect to the Federal Register notice for the use of $8.3 billion for mitigation activities, the OIG report described months of negotiations between HUD and OMB, which resulted in several revisions to the notice text, mostly at the request of OMB. Several HUD officials found some of these OMB requests to be unreasonable or outside the scope of normal administrative procedure. For example, Deputy Secretary Montgomery, during his OIG interview, characterized OMB's revisions as containing, quote, poison pills, because they would impose unworkable criteria, and he was not sure it was even, quote, legal to insist upon grantees meeting these conditions. Furthermore, OMB requested the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs to review the proposed Federal Register notice, which a HUD attorney described as, quote, unheard of for a disaster-related notice. Another HUD official described OIR's comments as, quote, kind of like Groundhog Day. It just keeps coming back. The next result of loading the Federal Register notice with poison pills and submitting it to a necessary administrative review was that the mitigation notice for Puerto Rico was not filed until January 27, 2020, 23 months and 19 days after the corresponding appropriation and 146 days after the statutory deadline. In contrast, HUD published a notice for the other 14 CDBG MIT grantees 150 days earlier on August 30, 2019, and a notice for USBI 139 earlier. While all the circumstantial evidence points to undue OMB interference as the principal cause of the delays regarding the disbursement of CDBG funds for Puerto Rico, the OIG report stopped short of doing so, perhaps because former OMB officials refused to cooperate with investigation, while OMB itself denied requests for information made by the Office of Inspector General. Nonetheless, former OMB head and then acting chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, said the quiet parts are loud when on an October 17, 2019 press conference regarding the Trump administration's withholding of military aid to the Ukraine, he stated that we needed to put this in context. This is on the heels of what happened in Puerto Rico, when we took a lot of heat for not wanting to give a bunch of aid to Puerto Rico because we thought that place was corrupt. This statement is problematic in several ways, but I would just like to highlight that no Puerto Rican official, no Puerto Rican government official has been indicted, much less convicted, of any malfeasance regarding the expenditure of federal disaster assistance funds with relation to Hurricane Maria. Nearly 4 years and 3 months after Hurricane Maria, the totality of the circumstances surrounding the federal government's response to the natural disaster strongly suggests that it was arbitrary and capricious, and that Puerto Rico was unreasonably treated in a different way relative to other jurisdictions affected by the 2017 disasters. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Massaras. Very, very good. We will now hear from Ms. Miranda.
Hi. Buenos dias. I am honored to be here today, and I will read a short version of my statement. A longer version has been filed on record. While over 4 years have passed since Maria, our reconstruction and recovery process seems to be stagnant. Hurricane Maria's force was extremely destructive, and so has been the response. It sometimes feels as if we are still under the heavy winds of Maria and only have paper towels thrown to us as support. I want to start by establishing the context that led to the disaster caused by Hurricane Maria. Disasters are caused or amplified by our existing social context. Vulnerability, poverty, and inequality affect our adaptive capacity and our ability to deal with these phenomena. Maria was a socioeconomic and a natural disaster. The lack of understanding that there are communities that are more vulnerable, poorer, and therefore with less capacity to react, recover, and adapt is in part what has perpetuated the inequity in the recovery process in Puerto Rico. Let's look at some important points about the recovery process. Hurricane Maria, or the lack of preparation for it, and the state of our infrastructure killed more than 4,600 people in Puerto Rico, 70 times the official toll, according to estimates in a Harvard University study. Neither the federal government nor the Puerto Rico government were prepared for the magnitude of the disaster. As an example of this, the Harvard study found that a third of deaths after the hurricane were due to interruptions in medical care caused by power cuts and broken road links. As the mayor stated, a report published on September 25, 2020 by the Office of the Inspector General of the Department of Homeland Security confirmed what we all knew, that the federal government was unprepared for the management of the disaster. Let that sink in. When it comes to spending, and a word that we prefer in La Liga is investing, the reality is not better. Recent reports establish that only 1% of the funds have been dispersed for permanent work projects. Other reports state that only 18% of the overall approved FEMA funds have been dispersed. How, one may wonder, with so much need and with the available resources, can we be so behind in our reconstruction process? FEMA's delay in damage inspections, too many changes or lack of staff from Core 3 and FEMA, and confusion over federal processes have caused this unforgivable man-made delay. To this, we must add, of course, the impact that the unilateral and ill-informed austerity measures imposed by the Fiscal Control Board have caused municipalities. Further complicating the reconstruction process is the fact that FEMA funds must be reimbursed. As stated before, municipalities are facing a multiplicity of constraints imposed unilaterally by the Fiscal Control Board as well as the central government. Municipal budgets are facing drastic reductions while the need of their constituents increase. As an example, from 2015 to 2018, municipal budgets recorded a reduction of almost 15%. It is expected that by fiscal year 2023-2024, 43 municipalities in Puerto Rico will be fiscally unviable. If funds must be spent to be reimbursed, but the available funds are extremely limited, municipalities must be strategic on how to invest their reduced resources, a task that would be easier to manage if the reimbursement process was not as slow as it is. It is important to note that funds that were directly allocated to local government, Funds A and B, were promptly dispersed and used, evidencing that local units of government can be more agile than the central government. We all know that there is widespread discomfort with the management of the FEMA funds by the central government, specifically with the company contracted by Core 3, ICF Incorporated. As an example, the mayor of Jayuya, the municipality with the most FEMA funds allocated, recently stated, and I quote, "These people, ICF Incorporated, do not work. And if they work, they change their minds and instructions every day," end quote. While we are here to talk about Puerto Rico, it is important to share that companies such as ICF have had previous allegations of breach of contracts at the federal level, and that should be studied. In the case of Puerto Rico, it is important to note that since 2018, ICF has signed contracts with Core 3 that surpass the sum of $406 million, in part to advise and give administrative consultancy to the municipalities and government agencies to obtain funds. The complaints expressed by the mayor of Jayuya are shared and amplified by other mayors that have stated that they face similar obstacles with ICF and with the burdensome and bureaucratic process established by the Core 3. It almost feels as if there were remaining winds from Maria impeding the recovery. To these obstacles, we must add the dramatic increase in material costs, the absence of labor, the lawsuits related to the lack of compliance from insurance company, the compounding effects of other disasters, and of course, the pandemic. All of this is further complicated by the delays caused by the Core 3 in the approval of documentation previously approved by FEMA. It is also important to note that Section 428 of the Stafford Act establishes that if costs increase after estimates are approved, municipal governments are responsible for the extra expenses. It does not mention anything about assigning responsibilities for the delays that lead to increases in construction costs. but there is more impeding the recovery process. And this is an incapacity to understand the consequences of decisions made at the central government. An example of this is the adoption by the central government of the advisory maps completed by FEMA. These advisory maps are incorrect, misleading, and dangerous. They do not consider previous mitigation projects funded with federal funds, and they also exclude many potential beneficiaries by identifying many communities as being in a floodplain. This is particularly impactful for many disadvantaged and economically disenfranchised communities who will not be able to receive the required funding, thus ending in displacement. We have a set of recommendations to deter the violation of our civil rights. They're in our reading statements, but I will read 3 of them that I think are instrumental. The first one is to communicate to the central government that FEMA's advisory maps are precisely that, advisory, and that these should not be adopted without the proper confirmation of their correctness. The second one is to complete an assessment about disparity in regulations to access funds imposed by our own government and that have a negative impact on the most disadvantaged and at-need communities. And the third one that I'm going to be sharing here is to complete an assessment on the impact of the federal impositions that are focused on formalized communities and that do not adapt to the legal framework or the reality of Puerto Rico. Time constraints do not allow me to delve into the topics that I have brought up here in a general way, but we are hopeful about this public briefing, hopeful that it will result not only in the identification of all the things that have gone wrong, but in actions to correct them and to prevent them from ever happening again. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Miranda. Mr. Padilla-Ruiz, we will now hear from you. Please proceed.
Ms. Chair and distinguished commissioners. Ms. Chair and distinguished commissioners, I'm going to be presenting in Spanish so you can put on your equipment. Todos sabemos los efectos que los huracanes Irma y María tuvieron sobre Puerto Rico y que fueron devastadores. Tanto el gobierno estatal como el gobierno federal subestimaron el impacto del huracán María. El gobierno de Puerto Rico no contaba con los recursos de respuesta rápida necesarios para enfrentar la magnitud del desastre. Agravó el hecho la falta de claridad en los roles de los gobiernos federales, estatales y municipales. FEMA no contaba con suficientes recursos aquí en la isla. No tenía porciones suficientes de alimento y agua para suplir las necesidades de 3.4 millones de personas. Los demás panelistas han comentado que los procesos para solicitar ayudas a FEMA son burocráticos y lentos. Entendemos la importancia de documentar el gasto público. No obstante, en una situación de emergencia, los procesos tienen que ser lo suficientemente flexibles para salvar las vidas de las personas. El impacto del huracán María nos dejó a oscuras, sin servicio eléctrico, sin agua potable, sin telecomunicaciones y con muy pocos alimentos. No teníamos suficientes reservas de comestibles y contábamos con pocos medicamentos. Ya en ese momento experimentábamos una pérdida significativa de profesionales de la salud, lo que añadió mayores retos para el acceso a servicios. Inmediatamente luego del impacto del huracán María, una parte importante de la población abandonó la isla en busca de atención médica por distintas situaciones crónicas de salud. Ni las autoridades federales, estatales ni municipales tenían un registro de pacientes con enfermedades crónicas ni con condiciones que requerían mecanismos eléctricos para su subsistencia. Quedó evidenciado el alto número de personas adultas mayores que viven en condiciones de vulnerabilidad y fuera del radar de las autoridades gubernamentales. El 81% de esa población solo tiene como ingreso los beneficios del Seguro Social y el 36% de esas personas adultas mayores viven totalmente solas. Quedó demostrado que los planes operacionales de emergencia de los hogares y las égidas no estaban adaptadas a la magnitud del fenómeno. Los hogares y las égidas, a pesar de contar con cisternas y generadores eléctricos, confrontaron problemas para los abastos de agua, diésel, gasolina y alimentos. Un informe de la Universidad de Cornell del año 2016 estimó que más del 21% de la población de Puerto Rico tenía alguna discapacidad, una tasa mayor que en cualquiera de los 50 estados. Sin embargo, muchas de esas personas con diversidad funcional carecen de los recursos y las ayudas económicas para sufragar sus gastos y atender sus necesidades. No hay manera de prepararse para un huracán con estas realidades. Las personas privadas de libertad bajo la custodia del Estado dependen de las gestiones del aparato gubernamental para que les garanticen sus derechos. Ellos requieren planificación adecuada para asegurar no tan solo la vida, sino los servicios que necesitan. Las estructuras donde enclavan las cárceles del país históricamente han carecido de elementos necesarios para atender emergencias. Su construcción no se adapta a las realidades del clima tropical y las estructuras han sido construidas sin ventilación ni luz natural. Por más de 100 días sin luz, sin aire, más de 10.000 personas en las cárceles padecieron y sufrieron los embates del huracán y nadie habló de esa población. La situación de las personas sin hogar es una de las más graves y complejas que confrontamos. Su análisis resulta ser espinoso por muchos motivos. Esta fue una de las poblaciones más adversamente afectadas por el impacto del huracán. De otra parte, documentamos el trato discriminatorio que recibieron las poblaciones diversas en su sexualidad, particularmente las personas de experiencia trans que fueron marcadamente discriminadas. Muchas de sus reclamaciones fueron rechazadas para recibir las ayudas por parte de FEMA, porque la información que obraba en su base de datos era incompatible con la identidad de género asumida por la persona solicitante. Era necesario alinear la información en el sistema antes de acceder a las ayudas en medio de una emergencia. La alimentación en el país fue afectada grandemente. La agricultura sufrió un gran golpe y el cierre de los puertos provocó un gran abastecimiento, el mayor de nuestra historia. Investigadores de la Escuela de Salud del Instituto Milken de la Universidad de George Washington concluyeron que la ayuda alimentaria provista por FEMA tras el huracán María no cumplió con las guías alimentarias de los Estados Unidos. También se evidenció una fuerte asociación entre la distancia y el largo periodo de tiempo sin cobertura de electricidad, agua y telecomunicaciones. En promedio, los hogares pasaron 84 días sin electricidad, 68 días sin agua y 41 días sin cobertura telefónica después del huracán María. El impacto del huracán destapó las vulnerabilidades de nuestro entramado social. Los huracanes dejaron al descubierto profundas desigualdades económicas y sociales y nuestras realidades para el ejercicio pleno de los derechos humanos. Somos la jurisdicción más pobre en todo el territorio nacional. Si todo lo que hemos comentado resulta duro, mucho más dura fue la experiencia de las personas residentes en las islas, municipios de Vieques y Culebra. En el documento escrito abordamos algunas de las recomendaciones para mejorar las respuestas de las agencias en la estructura federal. Sin embargo, sin pretender polarizar esta discusión, un tema del que no podemos escapar para tener una reflexión honesta sobre el trato discriminatorio del que somos objeto los puertorriqueños y las puertorriqueñas que vivimos en esta isla es nuestra situación política. Para poder superar todos los problemas que comenté y las inequidades de Puerto Rico y de cara a cualquier evento futuro, es necesario que el Congreso de los Estados Unidos atienda el tema de nuestra situación política para el ejercicio pleno de nuestros derechos. Y estoy disponible para contestar cualquier pregunta. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Padilla Ruiz. And now we will hear from our final panelist for Panel 1, Ms. Yentil.
Thank you for the opportunity to testify. At the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, we have been working on disaster housing recovery for over 15 years, and from those experiences have come to a simple conclusion. America's disaster housing recovery system is fundamentally broken and in need of major repair and reform. The system fails to address the unique needs of the lowest income and most marginalized people, consistently leaves them behind in disasters, and often worsens many of the challenges that low-income people faced prior to the storm. This inequitable disaster recovery was exemplified by the response to Hurricane Maria. FEMA's response in Puerto Rico was flawed in many ways. My focus and the focus of the National Income Housing Coalition is on the response to housing needs. A primary challenge was FEMA's refusal to utilize proven programs to address housing needs. After Hurricane Maria, FEMA relied heavily on the Temporary Shelter Assistance Program, TSA, which temporarily puts people up in hotels. Low-income families are often unable to access TSA motels due to financial and other barriers, including the practice of motels charging daily resort fees and requiring security deposits or credit cards at check-in. Because TSA must be renewed every 14 days, disaster survivors who do access the program face regular arbitrary deadlines that require them to resubmit paperwork or leave the motel before finding a permanent housing solution. The Trump administration abruptly terminated the TSA program for nearly 2,000 Puerto Rican families displaced to the continental U.S. and refused to activate the Disaster Housing Assistance Program, which would have provided them with longer-term direct rental assistance and case management services. Many disaster survivors became homeless as a result. In states with large numbers of displaced Puerto Rican survivors, homelessness increased by 14% in Massachusetts, by 17% in Connecticut. This is a pattern seen again and again after disasters in recent years, including after Hurricane Harvey, where 1 year after the storm, homelessness had increased by 18%, with 20% of those newly homeless attributing their housing loss to the disaster, a clear example of FEMA's extraordinary failure to meet the housing needs of disaster survivors. FEMA has a systemic lack of transparency and a convoluted application process. FEMA consistently refuses to clarify or make public important information about its aid application process, making it difficult to determine who is eligible to receive assistance and why assistance is denied. This leads to higher denial rates for low-income disaster survivors. A full 60% of applicants were denied individual assistance after Hurricane Maria, and many disaster survivors with the lowest incomes don't apply for assistance at all, despite their need. FEMA failed to address title documentation issues and denied survivors assistance to which they were entitled. After Hurricane Maria, FEMA denied assistance to at least 77,000 survivors due to a lack of property title. This followed a similar pattern after disasters in the continental U.S. for decades. FEMA has been aware since at least 1995 of this challenge and the harm it does to low-income and marginalized communities, but until very recently has done nothing to address it. After Maria, NLIHC and partners like Ayuda Legal and El Fondo engaged with FEMA to create a sworn statement allowing those without title documents to prove ownership. And still, FEMA refused to notify survivors of the new form or make the statement available online. The Biden administration's FEMA recently made substantial and long overdue improvements to this process, but more action is needed. FEMA must now allow survivors in Puerto Rico and across the nation who were previously denied by FEMA the opportunity to reopen their cases, to access the assistance to which they are entitled. After FEMA's inadequate response to Hurricane Maria, HUD delayed assistance to Puerto Rico and failed to provide oversight to ensure that funds were being distributed equitably. It took 6 months for Congress to approve money for Puerto Rico's recovery and more than 2 years for HUD to fully allocate disaster mitigation funds. When HUD resources do arrive after disasters, recovery and mitigation efforts consistently favor higher income communities at the expense of low-income communities and communities of color, which are often located in areas at higher risk of disaster with less resilient infrastructure. In Puerto Rico, long-term recovery funds are provided only to those able to ensure their homes will comply with flood protection standards. But the recovery program doesn't help lower-income disaster survivors to implement any mitigation measures, nor does it ensure that low-income residents are served by mitigation projects. As we work towards a complete overhaul of disaster housing recovery to center the housing needs of the lowest income and most marginalized survivors, including people of color, people experiencing homelessness, people with disabilities, and others, there are immediate steps that Congress should take to improve the process, including permanently authorizing the Disaster Housing Assistance Program and automatically activating it after major disasters to provide longer-term housing assistance and wraparound services to low-income survivors. Permanently authorizing the CDBG-DR program and including essential protections and assurances of equitable distribution and public participation. Enacting the Housing Survivors of Major Disasters Act to allow Puerto Ricans to reopen their denied cases and receive the FEMA assistance they are entitled to. Requiring that FEMA provide basic essential information about federal disaster response and recovery efforts, including eligibility, the application process, and reasons for denial. And requiring FEMA to provide categorical eligibility, simplify the application and appeals process, and track and report on outcomes and demographics to ensure recovery aid reaches those in need. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Yentel. Everyone was wonderful, on time, and now we are turning to the place in this agenda where you will accept questions from the commissioners. Would a commissioner, we'll start with the people in person. Would a commissioner in person like to ask any questions directed to the panel? Commissioner Yaki?
Thank you much, Madam Chair. I want to focus on, in every disaster, there's the response and the recovery. I want to focus on the response for right now, because the recovery is a whole different issue, but I think the response is related to this. If, from your experience, I'm going to start with Maricruz Soto first, and then everyone else can chip in. But from your experience on the ground at the time, why was aid so late, and in the forms of aid that you received so inappropriate to what you believed your needs really were?
I've been asked this question many times in the past years, and it took me a long time to even utter the response. And I think Secretary of State and Mr. Padilla referred to it. We are a colony of the United States. Black and brown people, poor. 60% of our people are poor. And simply our lives did not matter to the people that headed the U.S. at the time. The problem is that this shouldn't matter on who is the president and whether they know Puerto Rico, they like Puerto Rico or not. You don't, a slave is a slave. It doesn't stop being a slave because his or her master gives her 3 meals a day and doesn't beat them on a daily basis. So what really happened is this became, we have to remember the Trump administration was, this was very early on. And there was a narrative from the Pentagon, from the White House, from FEMA federal officials to position Puerto Rico, and this was el titular, the headline, as a good news story. But the world was here. I denounced it. I have to say that I was politically bashed by the opposition, because here in Puerto Rico and in the United States, because they said I was making this up. But really what happened is that Puerto Rico response became a blemish in the Trump administration worldwide. And then rather than making it better, they made it worse. There have been reports saying that not only in the Inspector General reports and OMB report, that not only did the federal government did not give us the aid, but they covered it up.
We heard about the water bottles on that never made it to Puerto Rico, that were sitting on the tarmac somewhere else, and
well, there was that. There was FEMA admitted paying a company in Florida about $50 million for food that never got to Puerto Rico, and then they rescinded the contract. I also remember, and Hispanic Federation has to remember this, that there were no tarps in Puerto Rico. It took them, again, a long time, 69 days, says the Inspector Generals. But this is the truth. When you have several crises at the same time, Harvey, Florida, and Puerto Rico, you choose to treat faster and quicker those that you consider your own. And I have to say this, and I say this, look, every day I wake up, and we wake up, and we think 3,000 Puerto Ricans or more did not open their eyes. We saw them, I saw them gasping for air. People without dialysis, people without chemotherapy, children that looked at a bottle of water and just wanted to reach out to you because you had a bottle of water 6 months old. So we saw this, and I think mayors of all parties in Puerto Rico saw this. But it is, and I don't want to politicize this, but it has to do with our colonial, we are colonial subjects. So our lives matter less. And on top of that, we're black and brown. And on top of that, we're poor. And we have to thank the diaspora, Chicago, Holyoke, Massachusetts, New York City. I remember going into New York City and seeing this entire place filled with different services. And the one that struck me the most, Mr. Yaki, was the place that contained the little coats for little children, 6 months old. So I am convinced, and believe me, it took me a very long time to be convinced of this, because you don't ever want to be convinced that your life does not matter just because you're politically a subject of another country that has colonized you. And I have great respect for the American people, because where the American government failed us, the American people and the diaspora, los puertorriqueños and the diaspora really took care of us. They fed us. They gave us water. They took care of our wounds. They held us in their arms and said, we care. AFL-CIO workers, 324 AFL-CIO workers took vacation and were brought to San Juan to help not only San Juan, but some 37 other towns around Puerto Rico. So I am convinced that it had to do with the disdain that the then president had. The problem is that this is a systematic and structured. So we cannot depend on another president being amiable to Puerto Rico. The systematic oppression and racism that being a colony gives us has to end. Whether the people of Puerto Rico want statehood, whether they want independence, whether they want an enhanced Commonwealth, or whether they want free association, we must be allowed, as a nation that we are, because we are a nation. We're not colonial subjects. Puerto Rico es una nación. We are a nation. And we must be allowed to decide the next chapter of our lives with the United States. I have my preference, but I've always spoken more about a process of self-determination than about the end of that process.
Thank you.
Commissioner Yaki,
Yes.
this is an issue about political representation. This is about an issue about power. This is an issue about the situation that has been managed by Congress and doing nothing for the last 120 years. And that's why we urge Congress to address the political issue of Puerto Rico in order to let us fulfill our civil and human rights.
Okay. Anybody else? I see lots of you.
I don't even know if I'm turning this on correctly.
There you
we go. So I want to echo what's been said for sure. And actually, the New York Times recently had an article talking about not just the biases in wealth that are part of FEMA, but also the racial biases that the data is clearly showing across FEMA services. So there's reports and evidence to back up what's being said. There were also major logistical challenges in terms of, I mentioned earlier, they claimed, oh, we shipped everything took too long, we shipped it. Airports were open. The very week afterwards, regional airports were open, and if there was a will to get stuff here, and if they had taken into account our geography instead of just shipping things and waiting for it to get here, working with contractors who, as they mentioned, that same OIG report shows they lost sight. They didn't use their GPS tracking. And so there were major problems in the logistics of what they sent. You mentioned the water bottles. It wasn't just water bottles. It was 20,000 pallets of water bottles that were delivered in March and then not found until September. In March, they were calling it surplus. In March, we were still distributing water filters to people who had no potable water in their communities. So the need was still there. Why it was sitting on a tarmac, I don't know, right? There are major problems in their contracting. You mentioned it was actually a $156 million contract that went to a woman in Florida who had already had canceled contracts with the government, multiple canceled contracts, yet they gave her that contract to provide food. Meanwhile, again, if you look at the comparison in the amount of food that arrived to Puerto Rico 9 days later versus Harvey, I think it was 5 million meals delivered to Texas, a little over 1 million to Puerto Rico in the same time period, and they're hiring failed contractors. The same could be said if you look at contracting, you want to look at discrimination. Actually, we cited in our report, and I didn't get to it in our summary, CNA has done an excellent job of tracking those contracts, and although the Stafford Act requires that there be preference given to contractors from the impacted area, that's the law, it's in the Code of Regulations, FEMA, 1 year after, had only contracted 8% of their contracts had gone to local companies. The reason we were able to distribute food to all 78 municipalities, we reached 60 in less than 2 months, despite the fact that at the time we had no on-the-ground office here. That didn't happen until January. Small nonprofit, able to reach all 60 municipalities, 78 within a few months after that, was because we contracted with local distributors. After we saw the backlog of containers and shipping containers and saw that that strategy wasn't going to work, unlike FEMA, who is incredibly bureaucratic in making decisions, we immediately switched strategies and discovered that the distributors here in Puerto Rico had their warehouses actually were full of food, and they had trucks full of gas that could do deliveries. So we made calls, made payments, and 1 to 2 days later, we're able to send pallets of food to all of the municipalities as soon as we found a mayor or a contract to send them there. Had they, instead of giving preference and looking to these contracts in the US and making these quick and rash decisions for failed contractors, which also happened with the tarps, that was a $30 million contract given to a tiny company in Florida, run by 2 brothers who had never dealt with tarps ever or even managed a federal contract, got a contract to provide tarps that they never provided to Puerto Rico. If instead FEMA had focused on, one, some of the strengths that are here in Puerto Rico, focused on supporting the local economy here in Puerto Rico and finding those here who could help, we could have moved things a lot faster as well. So I think there were a multitude, echoing what was already said, adding to that these types of issues.
Just push once. Oh. There you go.
There we go. Just a brief comment. I don't know why this came to mind, listening to Mayor Cruz Soto. I really want to highlight, though, what I think is the fundamental issue here. And what came to mind was a quote from President Kennedy that he gave a speech on June 1963 when George Wallace was standing at the door of the University of Alabama to prevent African-American students from registering to study at the University of Alabama. And President Kennedy, if I remember correctly, said in that speech that the issue that was facing the nation back then, and I think it's appropriate here in Puerto Rico right now, was as old as the scripture and as clear as the U.S. Constitution. It's whether we are willing to treat our fellow citizens with the same rights and the same equal protection under the law. It's whether we're willing to treat our fellow human beings as we would like to be treated. In the case of Hurricane Maria, as a Puerto Rican, as a U.S. citizen, as a human being, I certainly will not like anybody to be treated the way we were treated. Thank you.
Yeah. If I may add, I agree with everything that's been said.
Yeah, I guess we need to make sure everyone's mics are off there.
Yeah? Yeah? Okay. I do want to add that we are a colony. It's something that we know, but it's important to also understand that if Puerto Rico is a colony, municipalities are the colony within the colony. So that's very important to also take into consideration. And I think there's a lot of causes to what happened. I think the first one is a lot of political will. There's a lack of political will at the federal government. There's a lack of knowledge in terms of who we are, what we mean as a country, our distance, et cetera. There's also a metrocentric approach to distribution of resources. It's sort of like Puerto Rico, it's only the metropolitan area. As an example, our central government invests 70% of our budget in 5 municipalities, where only 25% of our population resides. So that's something to take into consideration. And there's also a narrative of incompetence and corruption that does not take into consideration the role of the federal government. That report from FEMA that says that the FEMA lost 38% of the goods that were coming to Puerto Rico at a cost of $257 million. If that had happened in Puerto Rico, we would have not stopped hearing about it, right? So anything that happens over there, it's sort of like, like hidden under the rug, and anything that happens here is magnified, but without the analysis of the context of how it happens. So I think that my response is shorter. They just don't care about Puerto Rico. It's as simple as that. We don't have to give a lot of introduction. Everybody knows we're a colony. The Supreme Court has said it, firmly. And it's just a reality that we're just here. We're an island. We were occupied. We were invaded. And that's it. They don't care. That's it.
Commissioner Adegbile?
Madam Chair, I believe the Secretary of State had a response.
Thank you. Please proceed.
Thank you, Commissioner. Just a brief remark. As I said in my intervention, what we requested in every single stage during the response, it was just equal treatment. We requested that we were just given a chance as every other jurisdiction in order to manage the process and respond our people in a swift manner. As many of the panelists said, yes, I believe that the biases that they had against the people of Puerto Rico had an effect. Also, the bureaucracy of FEMA, and from a science of delivery perspective, also the lack of internal capacity of FEMA to manage several disasters across the nation. But obviously, the political status, it was the main issue. The fact that we don't have representation in Congress, the fact that we don't vote for the president, and the fact that we all know that this will not happen in the great state of New York or any other great state, makes quite clear that our political status, the fact that we are subject to the plenary powers of Congress, we did not have the same treatment as any other jurisdiction. Also, that allowed for some in the administration at that time to get away with the narrative that the people of Puerto Rico were just incompetent and were not able to manage federal funds in a swift manner. And not only we have seen what happened during the response with the municipalities, but also we took into consideration how the municipalities were so effective in managing the federal disaster funds that we received during the pandemic. This is a real example that you can use as a benchmark. In the case of the pandemic, the government of Puerto Rico received, as any other jurisdiction, direct funding from the federal government, and we were able to effectively deploy those funds in order to address the people of Puerto Rico with no, in comparison with other jurisdictions, we have done a phenomenal job in doing so. And this is very important to see, because as opposed to the FEMA process, you know that you have to go through an obligation and then request for reimbursement, so the process takes longer. But when we have the ability, and when we have the opportunity, I should say, to manage the process, we can do it in a very professional way, as done in many other states. So, but also, I have to reemphasize what other panelists said. The fact that we are considered, or the fact that we are not seen as American citizens, as any other American citizens in the nation, definitely allow some in the federal administration to take that approach with the people of Puerto Rico. But also I have to highlight, as Sergio Marsach said, we also have to be fair with the federal administration. We had some friends in many areas of the federal that they were trying really hard to expedite the process, but unfortunately we saw that that atmosphere percolating across the federal government, just putting obstacles for the people of Puerto Rico. And this is not just me saying it, it's because I was there in many meetings in Congress, many meetings, FEMA, HUD, DOE, Treasury, and even the White House. And unfortunately, every single time that we comply, as I said, the goalpost was just moved.
If I could just briefly add one more, I fully agree with all of my colleagues here and defer to them on the primary reasons. But just to add briefly one more piece of the puzzle is that FEMA is, as an agency, extraordinarily rigid and unable or unwilling to adapt to unique needs. So they follow a script and a playbook, which is already flawed and doesn't meet the needs of low-income and marginalized people. And then they failed to adapt that playbook to clearly unique circumstances.
Madam Chair, may I? Thank you for all of your thorough responses and the very substantive details you've been providing to us. I want to pick up from this last statement that you made, Ms. Yentl, and focus everybody for a second on the idea that because we are a U.S. Civil Rights Commission, we are particularly focused on the civil rights dimension, which many of you have spoken to. And I want to just sharpen some of the dialogue on these issues so that we can be clear for purposes of our report. Some of what I've heard is that the federal response was inefficient, bureaucratic, slow. Some of what I've heard is that there's a sense that the federal response was motivated by treating Puerto Rico differently because of perceptions of race, language status, and other protected characteristics. And what I'm asking those of you who can respond to this to try and put in lights for us is to share the best direct or circumstantial evidence that the flawed response was in fact due to these civil rights issues and not just inefficiency and bureaucracy. Both contribute, I'm quite sure, based on what you've shared with us, but I just want to make sure that we're not missing the best evidence that you can marshal that what we have here are actual civil rights violations. Thank you.
And let me add, the rest of the list is age, religion, disability status, and violations of the Constitution. Sex, any other categories? Those are all of the lists that we want to hear from. Yes.
And national origin, which I think a lot of you touched on.
Yeah, if I may, I talked about the deaf population as an example. FEMA has the capacity, and it offered it in Harvey, to have personnel that have American Sign Language as part of the way that they communicate. That would even have been a problem. They never offered that in Puerto Rico, but that would have been a problem because American Sign Language and Puerto Rican Sign Language are totally different. The structure of the way that information is communicated in the Puerto Rican deaf community is quite different. But I want to point out, and I think it was Ms. Yentl that mentioned it, a lot of Puerto Ricans don't have property titles, título de propiedad. That is especially true, and I'm sure you've heard it, Ms. Cantu, from the people at Loíza and El Caño Martín Peña. It took FEMA about 3 months to be able to tell the municipalities and the central government, listen, let us go with just an affidavit, thank you, an affidavit that states that your neighbor knows that you've been living there for X number of years. It is a clear violation of civil rights. Why? Because, first of all, you don't have equal access to the way that you are being treated or to the services that you have a right to be provided. Also, we have in San Juan and in other areas of Puerto Rico, but mostly in San Juan, a very large Dominican population, people that came from the Dominican Republic with or without the appropriate papers to be in Puerto Rico. I don't like to call anyone illegal. They just don't have the appropriate papers and undocumented. Yeah, just this morning we woke up to the news that New York passed a legislation stating that anyone can vote in their elections. So, you know, it's moving forward. But it made it a lot more difficult for people that were undocumented to come forward, because when they see somebody dressed with the federal seal, they think of ICE. So they don't come forward. And at a time like that, people have to come forward. But also the people that were, and I'll give you an example. There was the ship, I forget the name of the ship that was brought. The U.S. Comfort. The U.S. Comfort was brought to Puerto Rico, and we thought, oh, that's great. It's really going to help. And then there were no guidelines, and people were denied treatment. People were denied. They were not allowed. If we send them to the U.S. Comfort, they were not allowed to go in because the U.S. Comfort would only deal with certain types of ailments. So time after time, there are specific examples. I just want to finish with this, with something that Ms. Miranda mentioned and Ms. Goed Navarro. In the U.S., the state of Texas receives money from FEMA, but also the cities directly receive money from FEMA, especially if the cities are above 500,000 or 350,000 people that are populated. No one in Puerto Rico, no city, San Juan at the time had 375,000 population. If there is a way, and where there is a will, there is a way, to not only leave that money at the state level in Puerto Rico, but to also treat it like other jurisdictions where they put the money in the hands of the municipalities and also have a plan for the municipalities to put the hands in the money of the non-governmental organizations. It is a lot faster. What we learned from New York City is to get our religious leaders, recreational leaders, our community leaders, and put the aid in their hands. I never went around giving boxes of food for political reasons. I gave it all to organizations that then gave the food for humanitarian reasons. And I think that looking at protecting the civil rights from the standpoint of the municipal government and the non-governmental organizations also helps to minimize some of those inefficiencies in the distribution.
Mr. Commissioner, as I told earlier, we do have people, trans people that was denied because of the system says a gender mark was different that they was assumed, and that's a clear missing of civil rights. That's a clear way to discriminate to those peoples because they have to go through an appeal process in order to get, and they were devastated because of the hurricane impact, and they was lost in the middle of nowhere trying to fight with this agency because of a gender mark.
Can I do a quick follow-up on that USS Comfort? One of the things that, I'm sorry, Commissioner Degbler, I just want to get this. One of the things that sort of boggles my mind about what happened with Maria is in most disasters, deaths occur at the event and not after the event. This was flipped in Puerto Rico because of issues of people who had dialysis, people who have diabetes. There are any number of different people who would fit the definition of disabled under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Did they attempt to get access to the USS Comfort? Was there any sort of recognition of this by the federal government in getting appropriate dialysis machines or supplies of insulin to this island? Because this information is available to the federal government. They have it all, whether it's through the census, the American Community Survey, whether it's their Medicaid stats. They know what the population health is like here and who's got what or more likely to have whatever. Did any of that occur?
Mr. Yaki, the Hospital El Maestro, which is very close by, needed generators. They did the forms, and they did the forms. The generator never came. The municipality of San Juan, at the time, we put the generators in there after their ICU collapsed. And why after? Because that's when we could get there. Ever since, while I was mayor, the Hospital El Maestro, which is a hospital for the teachers that have worked in our public system, every time there was a blackout, which in Puerto Rico occurs every day, I'm living now in Massachusetts, but my parents, my brother and my daughter live in Puerto Rico, and it's like, it's a joke, you know? And it's not a joke, because we don't want electricity to take warm showers. We wanted electricity at the time so our doctors did not have to operate with the light on their cell phones. So no. FEMA, you put out a form and you ask for it and you ask for it, and nothing came. Because I screamed and I complained a lot, they put an entire battalion of people from FEMA to work at the Coliseo Roberto Clemente, which was the largest shelter in Puerto Rico. And what they did was handled the paperwork. I don't know if Ms. Miranda has gotten this information from other mayors, but we inputted the information in one system, and then they literally would tell us, no, that's not good. Now you have to input the same information in another system. This is why I have proposed that we should come up at the U.S. national level and at the Puerto Rican national level with an emergency management system that includes all of the information previously. We know what a Category 1 hurricane is going to reflect in terms of maybe, you know, the Centro for Nueva Economía can tell us. Category 1, this is usually how much we are going to lose. So we shouldn't be waiting for the administration, whichever administration it is, to decide what they're going to approve from now on. So the answer is no. These hospitals, and I went to various hospitals in San Juan, did not receive what they had asked from FEMA, because simply FEMA did not have generators in hand.
And the comfort wasn't
The comfort, you would ask for people to be in an intake in the comfort, and they would tell us, no, it's not for that type of women that wanted to give birth. It's not like you decide when you want to give birth. So I want to give birth in a place where I know that my child will be taken care of.
So, I mean, what were the criteria? You had to be maimed or something like that to get on? I mean, if you're in a medical emergency, wasn't that the whole purpose that they trumpeted, the comfort being?
Trauma. If you had trauma, severe trauma, then, but not for...
Diabetic shock, no?
No. And
dialysis, renal failure from dialysis?
No, and I'll finish by saying this. At the municipality of San Juan, with the University of Sagrado Corazon, and I know what I'm going to say, it's going to be controversial. They had about 30 Cuban doctors that were studying to become nurses in the United States. And the president of the University of Sagrado Corazon brought them to San Juan, and we went through communities, just scouting for people, and gave out about 736, of course, you know, it might be 700 and more than that, but medication that we identified people. And we would go back and give them the medication again and again and again. So there's no national Puerto Rican stockpile of things like diabetic insulin and so forth, high blood pressure, asthma medications. We established things called Centers for Citizen Transformation, where they would have access run by the communities. And Comerío is doing one next week, run by the communities to deal with basic health issues at the community level.
If I can add to your question, one, I'm going to find for you, I recall quite a few articles coming out around the problems with the comfort and how they were turning people away. So I'm going to search those and share them. And I'd also like to put you in touch with MAVI, which is an organization that I referred to earlier, not by name, but when I was speaking in my report. Immediately after Hurricane Maria, they requested that data from FEMA because they're an organization that their expertise is advocating for and providing services to people with disabilities all across Puerto Rico. And they knew that those people were going to have special needs and that needed to be immediately attended to. They did not receive that data. At first, they were denied because they were told it was a confidentiality issue and there was no way around that. After their insistence, suddenly FEMA found a way around it. And yes, with an MOU, they could get that data. They provided that MOU. It still took them 9 months to give that data to MAVI. As a reminder, those 3,000 people, more than 3,000 people who died in that aftermath, many from those chronic health issues and disabilities, died in the first 6 months. And had that data been provided to that organization, they may have been able to pull their resources together to provide the support to those folks. But as was mentioned in mine, and you just mentioned it, FEMA was not working with the nonprofit organizations here on the ground who know their communities best, who were the first responders. And we have seen this in each of the disasters since. There is, for some reason, a resistance from both FEMA and the central government in Puerto Rico to partner with the network of community-based and grassroots organizations to capitalize on their expertise and the trust that they have in communities. And the result of that was lives lost, and in particular, our disability community.
Great. I think that there may be a couple that just wanted to come back to my question about.
Yeah, that's.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank
I
you.
wanted to add, I agree with everything that's being said, but I think, and I understand your question in terms of the specificity, I can't even say it in Spanish, but I can understand the question, but I think it's more systemic than just an example. In the case of the League of Puerto Rican Cities, and I agree with what Charlotte is saying and the mayor are saying, that nonprofit organizations, community organizations were first responders, but so were municipalities. So in the League of Cities, what we're advocating is to move from resilience to systemic change. Because the focus on resiliency, what it means is that we have to keep on being prepared to survive whatever comes our way. I'm tired and exhausted of being resilient. I can understand resiliency from a climate change perspective, but when it comes to recovery, for you to ask me and my communities to be resilient is really a slap on the face. So I think the conversation has to be more about the system that we have and how there has to be real systemic change to impede the violation of civil rights. We can give you a list of concrete examples if you want. If we have more time, we can send it your way, but I think overall, the conversation has to be about the system that we have and how there has to be real systemic change that moves us from resiliency to real equitable development and recovery. So I think that that's something that should be included.
To add to that question, specifically, I think we can look to the fact that President Trump wanted to sell Puerto Rico as a response, right? If we want to see of what the attitude was towards Puerto Rico in particular, I think that gives a clear example. And also in language access. Language access is protected under the Civil Rights Law for national origin. Puerto Rico is clearly an example of that. In 2000, President Clinton put out an executive order that required federal agencies to provide meaningful language access. I do not believe FEMA is complying with that. There is guidance, specific guidance on when that meaningful access has to be provided. I'm going to read it and you determine whether Puerto Rico meets these standards. The 4 factors that are supposed to be considered is 1, the number or proportion of LEP, limited English proficient persons who are eligible to be served or likely to be encountered by the program or grantee. In Puerto Rico, that's everybody. The frequency with which LEP individuals come in contact with the program. In a disaster relief program, understood. The nature and importance of the program, activity, or service provided by the program to people's lives. What is more important than your disaster relief and recovery? And the resources available to the grantee, recipient, or cost. And in the case of FEMA, with Puerto Rico alone, has over $38 billion at its disposal. That's only Puerto Rico. I believe Puerto Rico meets all of those standards, and FEMA should be in compliance with language access, and they absolutely were not in the response to Hurricane Maria.
I just want to check to see if Ms. Yentl wanted to weigh in on this topic, and then there may be others.
Thank you, and I would agree with everything that has been said, and especially the last comments, which I was going to touch on and won't, but I would just come back to the title documentation issues as what I think is one of the clearest patterns of discrimination by FEMA for decades. After Hurricane Katrina, there were thousands of people in Alabama and Louisiana, disproportionately Black households in predominantly Black communities that hand down homeownership more informally, that were denied assistance. After Hurricane Michael in the Panhandle, 50% of families, households, were denied assistance due to title documentation. Again, it was in the region of the state that is disproportionately people of color and disproportionately poor. After the after the wildfires in California, 70% of applicants were denied assistance due to title documentation. Again, these were predominantly Latino farm workers who, again, had informal documentation and were denied. In all cases, FEMA was aware that the issue was as simple as having alternative documentation, but chose instead to deny households. And again, in Puerto Rico, 77,000 households were denied for that reason. FEMA has made improvements very recently, and they're important improvements. They do nothing to help all those households that have already been denied, and especially in the case of Puerto Rico and the more recent disasters, FEMA should be required to reopen those cases, allow those applicants to reapply and receive the assistance they're entitled to.
One clarification on that point. Does the requirement of showing title exist in the law?
What's actually by FEMA's own rules, FEMA is allowed to use alternate documentation, but they refuse to do so again and again.
So it's a practice, in a sense, it's a
Yes.
practice that's being used that is having discriminatory impact over and over again in disaster region after disaster region, is what you're telling us.
Exactly right.
Thank you.
One very specific example, once they got over FEMA calling beef jerky an entree, when you look at the box, it said entree, and it was a beef jerky. Then they went to military ratio food. The instructions for that were in English. And a lot of cases, people would burn themselves. Because if you didn't know what you were doing, you could burn yourself. So one of the things that I've said in my written recommendations is, and that I've suggested to FEMA many times with no avail, is that we can deputize municipal employees. We can train municipal employees in all 78 municipalities. Not all of them are going to be able to work in a disaster like this, which I hope in my lifetime I never get to see again. But FEMA can deputize them, and then they would have access immediately to thousands of people that speak Spanish, that know the culture, and that can help them navigate within. And that would be a very easy way to ensure that we have the appropriate amount of people and make sure that the intellectual property of those processes stays in Puerto Rico.
I yield to Commissioner Kaladny.
Commissioner?
Thank you, Madam Chair. We've talked about a lot of different problems. Is there one location where you can talk about the solutions in preparation for the next type of disaster? In other words, is there a list of solutions that you propose to assist Puerto Ricans in the face of another disaster?
Yeah, yes, resounding absolute yes, bold underscore. Yeah, there's a lot of things that can be done.
Will you provide them to us?
Yeah, I can. Do you want me to read them now? Yeah.
We
So
only have a few more
So I'm going to
minutes
give
for
you
questions.
three, but I think that the first one would be to decentralize recovery funds to ensure a more expeditious, equitable, and just recovery. Puerto Rico is heavily centralized, and there's a metrocentric approach that impedes access to those. So I think that would be one. I think that the other one that I would highlight would be to reduce the risk of disaster recovery spending at the local level through the allocation of funding to increase the capacity of municipalities. I agree with what the mayor is saying, that municipalities should be seen as a great resource that we have. They are the first responders, so we can submit you have our written statement, so our recommendations are there. But I think decentralization would be the central thing that should be done.
I'm quite interested in the response to disabled people. And yesterday we went to a couple of communities just maybe a half hour away, which could be very far away if the roads are blocked. And I think Director Padilla-Ruiz spoke about a list of disabled people. Is there any inventory taken as to how you can assist disabled people in these communities outside of San Juan? And were they assisted in San Juan at the one shelter? Was there any actual assistance provided that could save their lives?
Yes, Commissioner. The municipality of San Juan ran 7 shelters. The largest shelter in Puerto Rico was Coliseo Roberto Clemente. We had about 850 people, 200 employees that remained there to sustain all of the other operations. We produced about between 5,500 and 6,000 meals a day to provide to everybody. But every shelter had an emergency unit, as emergency as it could be. We could deal with everything except sutura. ¿Cómo se dice sutura? Except, suturing, major suturing. We had our ambulances, and then we could send them to the municipal hospital, which was very close by. But one of the things that we did is we relied a lot in the community organizations, non-governmental organizations. And you can go to Playita right now. They have the first Center for Citizenship Transformation. And they had, which was done after Hurricane Maria, but we had already been working with their leadership of all political parties. I don't even know which party they belong to. And they had a list, row by row, street by street, of the conditions, health conditions of each one of the people.
And that was in San Juan?
That was in San Juan. But I know the same thing happened in communities in Comerío, in communities in Loíza, in Rio Grande, San Sebastián, where the mayor was very active. And in fact, San Sebastián was the first municipality that, with their volunteers and municipal employees, put their electrical grid to work, not waiting for PREPA at the time or the central government. So there were some efforts at the municipal level and by non-governmental organizations. It depends on the municipality, how tight you are with them, and how the information is. We knew at the municipality of San Juan of 4 people that on any situation we called because they needed they needed oxygen and machinery to keep living.
Right.
So we would call them up, pick them up, take them to the hospital, and keep them there to make sure that they were taken care of.
So-
But that could be done at a national Puerto Rican level in a more structured way. But I would put the weight on the non-governmental organizations and the municipalities to support whatever the central government can provide.
Yeah,
Oh,
can I
go ahead.
add, and we got connected through Hispanic Federation, but there's La Liga is partnering with 3+ Connect to develop an app that will allow us not only to close the gap between the disaster and the needs that the community needs. And what we asked the team, and I don't know if Charlotte is going to talk about this, but one of the things that we asked was, let's not only think about how do we disperse the goods that are coming, the commodities, but how can we have an assessment, like a community census, per community, per municipality, where we could have the data and we can have like a continuous community survey that would be done every year to identify the needs. So that's something that we're working on right now with this organization. But as you know, that it takes money. So there has to be political will from the central government to understand that a tool like this that is managed by an organization in collaboration with other nonprofit groups and in collaboration with municipalities is something that should be an investment. Recovery, it's more than buildings, it's systemic change. So we're advocating for that as well.
Do you believe that there were any extraordinary delays in receiving funding that you've mentioned because of discrimination? Do you have any evidence of that?
We can provide some from some of the investigations that have been looked at into, again, how the Trump administration particularly put many of the things that were mentioned that were barriers. We can look to those and assume that those unique barriers that were forced on Puerto Rico were probably done intentionally with an effort to prevent funding from getting to Puerto Rico that created delays. Whether there was an explicit line that says we're doing this to delay it, no. Was that something that can be understood by many of the decisions that were made, that you could assume that they were going to cause delays? I think so. And so if we collect a lot of what has been said here today, we'll see that those decisions that were made and applied uniquely to Puerto Rico, those administrative barriers, that moving of the goalpost constantly, seem to have been intentional interference. And this we've seen along the way, not just with FEMA, but with other funding that has come to Puerto Rico through Department of Education, through HUD and others.
I have looked at the HUD funding specifically, and if you read the report from the Office of the Inspector General that came out in April, it's very clear that they were playing some sort of game with Puerto Rico. I mean, it's very hard to pinpoint a specific individual and say this person specifically wanted to discriminate against Puerto Rico, but the language that was used by former HUD officials that agreed to be interviewed by the Inspector General, I think is very clear. I mean, they mentioned things like poison pills. They were concerned about whether some of the things OMB was requiring were even legal. Inside HUD, they were questioning that. Also, the submission to review by OIDA, it's unheard of in the case of disaster relief, and those funds were subjected to that additional review. So if you look at the totality of the circumstances, at least to that $8.3 billion tranche for mitigation activities, I think it's very clear that the intent was to delay as much as possible the disbursement of those funds to Puerto Rico.
Thank you very much.
Can I just follow up really quickly? Has anyone done any look, you talked earlier a lot about how all these contracts are going to the mainland and not going locally. Has anyone done a look to see were those contracts going to white majority firms versus the fact that if they were to do local contracting here, they would, just by sheer numbers, be going to black and brown owned firms?
We put out a dashboard. Some of my colleagues at the Center for the New Economy, which Ms. Gosset Navarro mentioned, but unfortunately we couldn't get that level of detail. We did identify, though, that over 90% of the contracting money was going to mainland firms, but we really couldn't get the granularity that you're asking for, and perhaps that's something that could be changed in the system going to the future, to request that data be produced so the analysis can be done by independent observers.
I do want to add this, a report that was published by Sembrando Sentido. It's included in our statement, but what they studied was CDBG-DR. And what's important to understand is that there's also a narrative in Puerto Rico by our central government that says that there's no capacity in Puerto Rico. We were really not ready to manage what happened with Maria. That's the reality. But the fact that we kept on signing contracts with outside consulting companies that have no cultural competence, that have they don't manage the language, and then they don't come to Puerto Rico and they hire Puerto Ricans to do the job is something that's really concerning for us. And one of the things that's concerning for us is that there's no knowledge transfer. This is resiliency as an example. If we want systemic change, we have to hire companies in Puerto Rico and build the workforce development, and we have to make sure that we have the capacity to withstand whatever comes our way. So that report is included and mentioned, but it's not for FEMA, it's CDBG-DR.
And just this one little thing. I wonder if you would agree with what I think I've been hearing, which is that decentralizing aid, using more whether to the municipalities or community-based organizations, could have the impact of addressing issues of language, cultural competency, knowledge of the disability community, persons in the different communities in immediate response. Do you agree or disagree?
Definitely agree.
Absolutely.
I mean, that is the way it should go. That is the way that it happens in some U.S. jurisdictions. And if I may, Mr. Cladney, just one quote. When asked why it took so long for FEMA to get things to Puerto Rico, this is a direct quote from the then President of the United States. It's because they are an island surrounded by water, lots and lots of water, ocean water, end of quote.
Thank you.
So when the head is not screwed on right, the rest of the body doesn't work.
I'm going to check in with Commissioner Gilchrist before we close today's first panel. If there's any additional information or an additional comment, please.
Madam Chair, I just want to thank the panelists for their remarks today. Very much interesting remarks, and I appreciate their time today. I also appreciate the commission having a way for those of us that were unable to be with you today to chime in. So again, thank you for your comments today, and thank you, Madam Chair, for allowing me to make those remarks.
Thank you, Commissioner. With that, I do appreciate that everybody got started almost exactly perfectly on time. And I also want to let you know we're going to be taking a 10-minute break. Do not go far away because we will start on time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.